At 3:17 a.m., Ibrahim Traoré's world was shaken by an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end, cold and commanding, made an ultimatum: restore Israeli mining contracts, reinstate foreign surveillance partnerships, and reverse all reforms that threatened Burkina Faso's sovereignty. The message was simple: comply or be removed. In that moment, Traoré had a choice to make: bend to foreign pressure, or stand firm and risk everything to protect the nation's independence. But this wasn't just about Burkina Faso's future. It was about Africa's future. For years, African nations had been at the mercy of foreign powers, their sovereignty negotiated away in exchange for financial aid or political favor. But now, here was a leader who dared to say no. His reply was swift and resolute: "I do not negotiate with extortionists." It was a rejection not only of foreign demands, but of the very idea that Burkina Faso should ever bow to outside control again. This wasn't just a political crisis, it was a defining moment in African history. The world would soon see whether one man's defiance could ignite a movement that would change the future of an entire continent. If you believe Africa's time to stand tall has come, stay with us. Hit subscribe and follow this journey to its powerful conclusion. At 3:17 a.m., Ibrahim Traoré received a call that would forever change the course of Burkina Faso's history. On the other end of the line, the foreign voice was blunt. "You have 48 hours to restore Israeli mining contracts, reinstate surveillance partnerships, and reverse the sovereignty reforms you've put in place. If you fail to comply, you will be removed from power." The words hit like a thunderclap. Burkina Faso had long been at the mercy of foreign interests, but under Traoré's leadership, the country had begun to take bold steps towards independence reforms that gave the nation more control over its resources and its future. Now that independence was being challenged by an external power, the foreign power's ultimatum wasn't just about contracts or diplomacy. It was an attempt to reassert control, to strip Burkina Faso of its hard-won sovereignty. For most leaders, such pressure might have led to resignation, or worse, a quiet surrender. But Traoré was no ordinary leader. In an instant, Traoré made his decision. He would not negotiate with extortionists. He would not bend the knee. His response was clear and uncompromising: "I will not abandon my people." Within hours, he convened a crisis meeting with his closest advisors, the Minister of Defense, the intelligence chief, and foreign affairs officials. The gravity of the situation became apparent as they reviewed the evidence of mounting pressure, satellite surveillance, cyber attacks, and questionable financial transfers. It wasn't just about negotiations anymore. It was about the survival of Burkina Faso as a free nation. Traoré knew that his decision would shape the future of the country. He had two choices: resign and hand power to someone more cooperative, or resist with everything at his disposal. The choice was clear. He chose resistance not only for Burkina Faso's future, but for the principle that Africa must no longer kneel to foreign demands. But that was just the beginning. The clock was ticking, and the pressure was building. What would happen next as the 48-hour ultimatum clocked down the pressure on Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso intensified? The first 36 hours after the ultimatum was issued were a period of profound challenge and momentum, building both for Traoré's government and the nation as a whole. The escalation of cyber warfare and media attacks. As soon as the foreign ultimatum was made, public cyber attacks began flooding Burkina Faso's vital infrastructure. The banking systems went offline, and power grids flickered, threatening to plunge the country into darkness. It wasn't just about crippling the economy. It was a deliberate attempt to create chaos and destabilize the country's fragile political structure. At the same time, a massive disinformation campaign was launched. Fake news reports flooded social media platforms, videos of supposed ministerial resignations, documents claiming corruption involving Traoré, and exaggerated headlines that painted him as a reckless populist destabilizing the nation. This digital assault was not just aimed at undermining Traoré's leadership, but at fracturing the resolve of the Burkinabe people. However, Traoré's government was prepared. A team of young cybersecurity experts worked tirelessly around the clock to dismantle the false narratives, block fake videos, and protect the integrity of national communication. They deployed backup communication systems and restored key services, ensuring that the people stayed informed and the government's message stayed intact. The national response: defiance and solidarity. While external forces launched their digital and media war, something extraordinary was happening in the streets of Ouagadougou and across the country. The people of Burkina Faso stood with their president. Instead of panic, the news of the ultimatum sparked a wave of defiance. Citizens began to gather in the streets demanding that their country's sovereignty be respected. Protests erupted with people chanting slogans like, "We are not a colony," and 48 hours try 48 years. It wasn't just a show of support for Traoré. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso's independence was non-negotiable. This wasn't just a passive demonstration. The solidarity among the people was palpable. They flooded the streets and gathered outside the presidential palace, waving banners that read, "Our minerals are not Israeli property." The people of Burkina Faso weren't just standing in support of their leader. They were asserting their right to self-determination. It was a collective stand, and it resonated deeply across the country. As the days went on, the streets of Ouagadougou transformed into a symbol of resistance. With every chant, every mural painted, and every slogan shouted, the sense of national pride grew stronger. Traoré's resolve had become theirs. His refusal to bow to foreign powers had become the rallying cry for a nation that had long been seen as insignificant on the global stage. The people once thought of as passive or apathetic were now united in a common cause: the growing pressure and the calm resolve of Traoré. While the people of Burkina Faso stood firm, the pressure from foreign powers continued to grow. The foreign voice that had issued the ultimatum called again, repeating the demands, but Traoré stood unwavering. He had no intention of conceding to external threats. The resolve shown by the people was all the validation he needed. By the end of the 36-hour mark, it was clear Traoré's stance had ignited something far greater than just a political battle for Burkina Faso's sovereignty. It had sparked a continent-wide awakening. Leaders from neighboring countries began to speak out, offering their support for Burkina Faso's right to chart its own course, free from foreign interference. The international community, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly uneasy. The Western media continued to portray Traoré as an unpredictable leader, but in Africa, his actions were beginning to take on a different meaning. He was being seen as a symbol of resistance, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all African nations that had long been subjected to foreign control. But as the deadline drew near, the final hours promised even more than just defiance. They would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Africa's struggle for freedom. As the final hours of the 48-hour ultimatum approached, the tension in Ouagadougou reached a boiling point. The world watched as Ibrahim Traoré and his people prepared for what was to come. The question was no longer just about Burkina Faso's sovereignty, but about the very future of Africa's independence. The final call, and Traoré's unyielding response. With only hours remaining, the same foreign power called one last time. This time, the tone was different, softer, more conciliatory. The threats had subsided, and the offer of negotiation was laid on the table. The voice on the other end proposed a shift in approach. "Perhaps your resignation isn't necessary. Maybe we can find a way forward together. Let's restore the partnerships." But Traoré, standing firm and calm, delivered a powerful response. 3 hours ago, you might have had a partner. But you made two mistakes. You threatened a democratically elected leader, and you underestimated the will of the African people. In that moment, Traoré wasn't just rejecting a deal. He was rejecting the notion that Burkina Faso, and by extension Africa, had to bow to foreign demands. His refusal wasn't about pride or stubbornness. It was about sovereignty and the belief that no leader, no nation should ever compromise their freedom for political or economic gain. The people's defiance and the growing strength of Burkina Faso. Outside the presidential palace, the crowds had grown in both size and intensity. What started as a few determined protesters had swelled into a mass movement, with people from all walks of life, workers, students, farmers, and elders standing together. Their presence was not just a sign of defiance, but a shield of legitimacy for Traoré's leadership. The chants grew louder. "We are not a colony, 48 hours. Try 48 years." These weren't just slogans. They were declarations. The Burkinabe people were showing the world that their resolve was stronger than any external pressure, that their sovereignty was non-negotiable. In the face of mounting challenges, they had found their voice. The government, despite economic sanctions and growing threats, remained steadfast. Key infrastructure continued to function, and essential services remained operational. The backup systems and cybersecurity teams kept disinformation at bay, proving that the nation could withstand both external and internal efforts to destabilize it. A global shift, the growing support from African nations. As the deadline neared, the diplomatic landscape shifted. Leaders from across Africa, particularly from Mali, Niger, Chad, and Ghana, began to speak out in support of Burkina Faso. It was a unified stance. An attack on Burkina Faso's sovereignty would be an attack on all African nations. For the first time, the African Union was not just a passive observer. The Ouagadougou Protocol was drafted, a document that would change the future of Africa's political landscape. It outlined a new framework for collective defense against foreign intervention. It stated that any attempt to destabilize or interfere in African nations' sovereignty would be seen as a threat to the entire continent. This was a powerful, unified statement of Africa's newfound resolve. The aftermath, a new era of African unity. As the 48-hour deadline expired, Burkina Faso had stood firm. Traoré, addressing the nation from the balcony of the presidential palace, stood before thousands of supporters. His words were simple yet profound. "Tonight I am still here. You are still free, and Burkina Faso still belongs to its people." The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, not just for Traoré, but for the entire nation. This was a victory not just for one leader, but for the dignity of the African people. Burkina Faso had proven that resistance, even in the face of overwhelming odds, was possible. While the economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure continued, the pride that now filled the streets of Ouagadougou was undeniable. Burkina Faso had won more than a political victory. It had won the moral high ground, and with it, the respect of Africa and the world. As the dust settled, the world was left to reconsider its view of Africa. No longer passive, no longer oppressed, Africa was standing tall. What would the rest of the world do next? As the 48-hour deadline passed, something extraordinary happened. The world didn't witness the collapse of a nation, but the emergence of a new Africa, one that was no longer willing to bow to external point in Africa, a continental. By standing firm, Ibrahim Traoré had not only secured Burkina Faso's sovereignty, he had also set in motion a broader shift in Africa. What true resistance could look like, and they weren't willing to be passive anymore. What was once viewed as a small landlocked nation at the mercy of foreign powers was now seen as a symbol of African defiance. Burkina Faso had shown the world that the future of Africa was in Africa's hands, no longer dictated by outside forces. Traoré's unwavering leadership became a beacon of hope for many other African nations that had long been subjected to foreign control. Burkina Faso, once a footnote on the world stage, had become the focal point of a continental movement for sovereignty and unity. The rise of Traoré as a continental symbol. Ibrahim Traoré, once an obscure military leader, was now seen as a continental symbol of resistance. His courage and the support he garnered from African nations had cemented his place in history. But what was even more powerful than Traoré's personal rise was the idea that Africa could unite and stand tall in the face of external pressure. He wasn't just a leader for Burkina Faso, he had become the leader of a new vision for Africa. He was a symbol of sovereignty, of resilience, and most importantly, of Africa's rising voice on the world stage. As Burkina Faso stood victorious, Africa itself had awakened. The question was now clear: what would the rest of the world do in response to a continent no longer willing to kneel? When the 48 hours came to an end, Burkina Faso was not defeated. Instead, it had undergone a profound transformation. What seemed like a political crisis had blossomed into a rebirth of national pride, a new era where sovereignty was not negotiable, and resilience had become the nation's hallmark. The people of Burkina Faso had stood their ground, and in doing so they had proven that no external force could undermine their independence. The economic sacrifices made in the wake of sanctions and international isolation were heavy, but they were seen as a necessary price for something far greater: dignity, control, and freedom. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership became synonymous with African courage and the unwavering belief that Africa's future must be decided by Africans themselves. Under his guidance, Burkina Faso had shown the world what true sovereignty looked like. The streets of Ouagadougou, once filled with uncertainty, were now filled with hope, unity, and pride. And Traoré's legacy was only beginning. He had become a symbol for all of Africa, a leader who had not only withstood external pressure, but had transformed his nation into a beacon of African unity. From this moment forward, no African leader would face external threats alone. As Traoré famously said, "We did not ask permission to be free. We rose to claim it." If Ibrahim Traoré's spirit of resilience has touched your heart, share the story. Subscribe to continue following the journey of an Africa that no longer bows down.